clear about, oh, thank you. I have a technical question. Can we put captions on as well? Is that something that we can do? Okay, thank you. All right, so let's get started. So a little bit about me. As I just said, positionality is really important to me. So I want to share a little bit about who I am and what brought me to the work that I do. Um, As Shannon mentioned, my name is JaeRan Kim. My pronouns are she, hers. I currently work as an associate professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Washington, Tacoma, situated on Puyallup and Coast Salish land. For visual description, I'm an Asian cisgender woman in my mid-50s with shoulder-length hair, black eyes, and I'm wearing a black sweater. Lots of black today. Um, I was born in South Korea sometime in 1968 and adopted to Minnesota in 1971 after spending time in orphanage care. I was in two different orphanages. And I've included here a photo of me with my younger siblings. My adoptive mother was pregnant with my sister, who I'm standing next to here in the photo. My sister was born just a couple of months after I arrived, and then my mom and dad had my brother about a year later, just over a year later. So within about an 18-month period, they had 4-year-old me, 1-year-old my sister, and then a newborn baby. So as you can imagine, it was pretty chaotic. And I think a lot about the fact that when I arrived in my family, I really only had a couple of months with my parents before there were other siblings involved. So um, these are some of the things that I didn't think about when I was growing up, but I've been thinking a lot about it more and more as I get older, and especially as I think about working with other adoptive families and adoptees. Jokingly, just a couple weeks ago, I was talking to my parents and I asked them when they were in the home study process of adopting me, were there any concerns? And they said the only concern that the social worker had was that my mom was pregnant with my sister at the time, and whether or not it was a good thing that I was going to be coming so soon when when they were adding another child to the family. I grew up in a predominantly white suburb of Minneapolis, Minnesota, in an evangelical Christian white middle class family. And while there was acknowledgement of the hardships that I had experienced before being adopted, there was really no discussion around adoption once I was here. For the most part, my parents were told by their social worker to assimilate me, that would be the best way for me to adjust into my family. And so they were really mindful of that. And that's exactly what they did. So, in other words, that meant there was no attempt to affirm my racial or ethnic identity in my adoptive family growing up. My racial and ethnic identity, in fact, was minimized in an attempt to assimilate me into the family. I didn't really realize it at the time, but it was I had internalized so much that by the time I was a young adult, I was really struggling to figure out my place in the world. And I got married really young. I eloped with my husband when we were 20 years old. We're still, surprisingly, somehow, still together after all these years. And then I had kids pretty young. But what ended up happening is around the late 1990s, so 1998, when I was about 30 years old, I began volunteering as a mentor in a program actually at my adoption agency, in a program that I later understood was a family preservation program. I didn't understand that at the time, but now, later on, I realized because what this mentoring program was is they were identifying high school students who were young moms who were quote unquote at risk of being involved in the child welfare system. And I participated in that program for about 3 years with a young mom. And it was until she graduated from high school. And it was really one of the best volunteer experiences I've ever had. The agency which again was my adoption agency, then asked me if I would switch over to the International Adoptee Mentoring Program, in part because some of the uh, Chinese and Korean adoptees that were in that program are really struggling, and they wanted somebody who had experience working with people that had more challenges. And as a result of that, and I should also say, this is how our lives overlap. At the same time, as I was doing this mentoring program in 1999-ish or so, I was also reconnecting with the Korean adoptee community, reconnecting or connecting, I should say, for the first time in a significant way, because I had known a couple of Korean adoptees throughout my childhood, but we weren't part of a community by any means. But what happened is I reconnected with somebody that I had met when I was in like first or second grade, and she had gotten really involved in the Korean adoptee community and brought me along with her. So in 2000, while I was kind of deep in this mentoring program, I also went to Korea and did a birth family search with a group of other Korean adoptees. And that is, as I'll talk a little bit later, that was my rupture. In my life when I really started to think about and understand adoption, my adoption in a really different way. So all of these experiences then propelled me at the age of 34, after being a college dropout. I decided I wanted to go back and understand child welfare and adoption better. So I enrolled in a social work program, got my undergraduate degree in social work, then started working in child welfare and adoptions. And it was when I was in adoption practice and child welfare practice that I really started to become aware of the problems in the system, in the adoption system, the way that we were kind of doing business as usual. I started my blog in my blog Harlow's Monkey in 2006, and it was my way of trying to process how it felt for me to be working in adoption as an adoptee. And I worked with the longest time I in my practice, I was working with foster youth who had experienced a termination of parental rights, and my job was to find them adoptive homes. So I was reading a lot of home studies. I was meeting with lots of foster parents and prospective adoptive parents, and of course, the bulk of my work was working with these young people, trying to help them be prepared for an adoption placement. And one of the things that I came to understand was that there was really a lack of connection between research and practice. So I was starting to become critical about the practices that I was had learned how to do in adoption work and in child welfare work. And I was thinking about, okay, well, we talk a lot about evidence-based practices. So then it made me really curious. I wanted to dig deeper and learn about the evidence that was supporting practice. And I'll be honest, I was really dissatisfied with it because the way the research was framed, I felt really lacked the adoptee's perspective. So that led me to start a doctoral program to learn how to do the research and to figure out were there ways that I could incorporate adoptee voices much more strongly into the adoption research. And so then that's what I did. And I've been really fortunate to be able to be doing that for the last 10 years or so. So that's about me, and I feel it's really important for you to know who I am and how that might affect the work that I do. And so, one of the things that I feel is lacking is that level of positionality from every other person who's working in adoptions. So I meet people who do adoption research but don't disclose that they're an adoptive parent or they're a birth parent or they're an adoptee. I think it's really important for all of us to talk about how we're connected to adoption. So Henry Giroux is a scholar of pedagogy, of critical pedagogy. And again, as I said, when I was in my social work education, my experiences working in adoption and child welfare, and now having been researching adoption more formally, I've come to really understand this quote by Henry Giroux, that the dominant culture actively functions to suppress the development of critical historical consciousness among the populace. And I think it's important for you all to be thinking about that I'm going to be quoting a lot of people who do critical pedagogy, meaning that the work that they do is really about how to help people understand not just their individual identity and who they are, but also the larger dominant society and how the system is set up to teach us and socialize us and to have us believe certain things. And then many of us don't ever know how to kind of actively deconstruct these messages and these theories that um, have been put out there that we just behave. We don't understand why we're doing what we're doing. And as I said, when I was working in child welfare and started to realize that the theory was informing and the research was informing the practice, the way we do things, that was kind of like the thing that really made me want to understand all the different connections because each of us individually, it's really about how we relate to other people who have shared experiences. So the way adoption has been conceptualized in practice has been harmful to all of us, and we just don't know it. And in fact, in my social work program, I never learned about the oppressive and colonial roots of adoption and child welfare in the United States. Formal adoptions, the way we practice adoptions in the United States, replaced community care for children and families. And so I really wanted to know, how did we get here? Okay, so how did we get here? The short answer is we were socialized to see adoption in certain ways. And scholar Bobby Harrow developed this model. Originally, they called it the cycle of socialization, and then later they changed it and titled it the cycle of liberation. In other words, it's how we are taught, quote unquote, how to be. And when we think about culture, culture is defined as the way we do things around here. And there's lots of different spaces that have different cultures. So I'm talking about like, how are we taught how to be in this world? So according to the cycle of socialization or liberation, you can see in this green square here, this rectangle up at the top, in the beginning, when we're born, all of us are born without any preconceived beliefs and ideologies. Our first socializations happen through our parents, family members, siblings, other people in our early childhood social environments, such as our neighborhoods, our schools. And so these socializations, these messages, the way we're taught how to see the world is then reinforced and added to by these institutional and cultural um, environments that we're in. So these might be our schools, the teachers in our schools. It could be the faith leaders and fellow peers in our places of worship. It could be in these broader institutions that oftentimes we don't actually, especially as young people, we don't really understand the influence of these other institutions, but there are things like our political leaders, our laws, the judicial system, those sorts of things as well. And then when we go to that yellow rectangle there at the bottom, these are the enforcements. And by enforcements, like what are the things that like reinforce these messages that kind of promote it and make it part of the mainstream? Those are going to be things like the media, books, the television, movies, social media, those sorts of things. And as a result, then they're also enforced by kind of both negative and positive enforcements. So negative ones could be peer pressure, stigma, shunning, incarceration even. If you don't behave the way we say you're supposed to behave or believe the way we think you should believe, then the external negative pressures can oftentimes be enacted on us. Um, But on the other hand, we could also experience enforcement through positive things like affirmation, for praise, for support, for rewards, if we uphold these beliefs and these messages. And so that means that many of us internalize these beliefs and we just kind of operate under the status quo until, and this blue rectangle here you see, there's an opportunity for change. Something that comes along that affords us the opportunity to rethink all these messages that we've learned. And so for a lot of us, this is when we get out into the world a little bit outside of the bubble or the protective family sphere that we've been raised in. So this might be going to college, it might be moving to another town to start work, it might be joining the military, it might be traveling someplace. But oftentimes these are the opportunities we have where we can kind of see the world or learn from people who have different perspectives than we do. So when we're given this opportunity to change, some of us do change. Some of us decide, no, we actually think that what we were raised with and all the lessons and messages that we learned feel good, sound good. We're going to continue with that. So this is again Bobby Harrow's or Harrow's, I'm not exactly sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, their cycle of socialization or liberation, or how we are taught how to be. And so this is, of course, talking about all the messages and all of the different ways we're socialized. But when we think about this from an adoption lens, we can start to see how the things that we learn, especially as adoptees or as adoptive families, those of you who are therapists and clinicians or professionals working with adoptive families, one of the things you might really want to be thinking about when you're working with your clients is where might they be when they're thinking about adoption? Have they had these opportunities for learning other people's perspectives? And are they being enforced or in through these positive or these maybe more negative ways? So, okay, the messages that we're socialized to believe then here. Oh, I'm sorry, just a minute here. My slides are freezing here. Okay, so we're socialized to believe um, these different messages and beliefs and ideologies and all these different areas here that I have on the screen. And really, they all relate to this idea of belonging. Okay, so these aspects of our identities, we're raised and reinforced with these messages about how we belong based on our ability, our health, our ethnicity, our race, our class, our gender, all these different things. And it's not just about belonging. The very first place that we are given messages about where we belong is our family. And then not just our family, but then eventually our society as well. So I'm going to pause here just for a second. So I'm going to start showing several slides that relate to adoption. And these are things that I've learned along the way. And as I talk about these different images that are going to be on the slides, I want you to be thinking about what messages, beliefs, and ideologies related to adoption are embedded in these different examples. And you can think about them in terms of these different domains on this slide as well. And also, I'm going to show you just a very small sample of kind of our adoption history, not a full range. There are so many things that I could include. So let's start with this first one. So this photo on the left side of the screen, the black and white photo here, is a picture of an orphan train. From the mid 1800s until 1929, an estimated 200,000 children from mostly urban cities like New York were sent by train to farming communities to work on farms or as domestic help. This was an idea that was created by Charles Loring Brace, who was a Protestant minister. and he worked for the New York Children's Aid Society. He believed that children who lived in poor immigrant families or who were orphaned and living in orphanages would turn out to be the future beggars, criminals, prostitutes of society. He called them the dangerous classes of New York. And in his view, rural life is therapeutic. So he created this intervention. And the myth around the orphan train movement was that these kids would be benefiting from living in a quote unquote family. But the reality is that most of these young people and the children and adolescents were not truly fostered or adopted. I mean, the intention was that they would work for the family who took them in. So the boys usually were working in the farms and labor. The girls were usually working to raise other children as child care providers or domestic help. And in fact, the term put up for adoption comes from these children being put up on platforms and being picked out by adults to be taken in. And so a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to visit the National Orphan Train Museum in Kansas. And I took a picture of this storyboard of a woman named Emily Reese, who's on the right side of the screen here. Now, Emily was born into a really large family. She was the youngest um, child out of, at least at the time here, it says of 12 children. She and her brother, who was just a little bit older than her, were placed in an institution because of family's poverty, and they weren't able to afford them, and they were too young to work. And at 11 years old, she was placed in a foster family with her brother somewhere in New York, but 2 years later, she was returned to the institution. They kept her brother, but they returned Emily. And then at 13, she was placed on an orphan train. And as the storyboard kind of describes, over the next 5 years, she lived in 4 different states with 7 different foster families. By the time she was 17, she was told she was going to have to go to yet another foster family. And she had told one of her friends, a close friend of hers, that she didn't want to go to this foster family and she didn't know how she was going to get out of it. And so he suggested they get married, and so they did. So this is just one of hundreds of stories. As I said, there were 200,000 children who were placed in the orphan trains. And one of the things that really struck me as I was going through this museum and looking at all the artifacts and the different stories was just how few of them ever were really adopted and taken in by loving families. The majority of them ended up moving from place to place. There were many really devastating stories of children being abused in these homes that they were placed in. It's really difficult. And I have to say, I'm really so grateful that people took the time and the effort to put together this museum so we could all see these artifacts of adoption history. Okay, this next series of photos here show the before and after of 3 Sioux youth, indigenous youth, who were forced into Native American residential boarding school. It's estimated that over 250,000 children were forcibly placed in residential schools as a way to educate and quote unquote civilize indigenous youth. But the intention really was about cultural genocide. The idea was that if the children grew up to forget their culture, it would be easier to subdue them, dominate the indigenous population, and take their land. The time period kind of overlaps with the orphan train movement. They started in the late 1700s, grew in really large ways in the 1800s. And up until the 1970s, there were still many that were still in existence. And in fact, part of the history between this and then the Child Welfare League of America and Bureau of Indian Affairs worked together to create the Indian Adoption Project from 1958 to 1966. where hundreds of children were intentionally placed for adoption, and they were intentionally placed, quote unquote, far from their reservation. So again, the idea was about assimilating them because it was thought that Indigenous families could not raise children and shouldn't raise children, and they were better off in white families. So between the combination of the Indian Adoption Project and the residential boarding schools, um, and to be clear, children were forcibly removed from their homes by social workers and by the police. Um, the Indian Child Welfare Act then was passed in 1978 as a response to the fact that up to a quarter of all Indian children were placed out of the home forcibly, either through these boarding schools or through the adoption project. Um, so it's not just the United States that had these Indigenous boarding schools. Australia, Canada, other countries have done this as well. But the United States so far has been the last country to apologize formally for this. And for those who might follow ICWA or Indigenous issues, President Biden just this past October 25th finally formally apologized for the US's role in it's really in incarcerating all these Indigenous children. This photo is of one of the very earliest Korean adoptees, Lee Kyung-soo. He was 4 years old when he was adopted by Navy Chief Vincent Palladino, and it made a lot of news, and in fact was one of the inspirations for the eventual Korean adoption movement. Many of the earliest adoptions from Korea were of U.S. military personnel stationed in Korea during the war. And it was really common at the time to dress up the young boys in military outfits and teach them how to salute. And they were called mascots. Sujin Pate has written a whole book. I'm trying to remember the name off the top of my head, but I can get it later, around this type of adoption and the military's investment in creating orphanages and creating these adoptees. It's estimated that around 200,000 children were sent out of Korea for adoption. And it was really seen as a patriotic act to adopt Korean children. So these are some photos of children in Africa. As we know, famine, civil wars, the HIV/AIDS epidemic really decimated many communities across the continent. And as a result, thank you, Kelly, for putting in Sujin's uh, book link in the comments. So many NGOs and faith-based organizations, as well as governments, went into Africa across the continent in different communities and created orphanages and developed adoption programs. And one of the things that I not jokingly say is that in Africa, um, if you build it, they will come. Meaning, if you build an orphanage, then eventually there's going to be an adoption program that comes out of it, because that is kind of the response is, what are we going to do with all these children who have lost their parents? Well, let's build an orphanage to house them and feed them and board them and educate them. Well, then we know that being in an orphanage is not a great place for a child to be raised. So then it creates the need for adoption programs because we want those kids to be in families. Although the idea of putting them back into the families they came from or their communities isn't their first response in many cases, which is why we ended up having to have international treaties protecting children, because there were so many cases where children were then just being funneled right into adoptive homes without due process. Okay, so this slide shows some media um, messages around Black families in the United States, particularly around this idea that Black families are so heavily using drugs that they can't take care of their children. And so there was in the 1990s this real strong message that there were all these crack babies and that they were being placed in dumpsters and abandoned in the streets. And so it was good white social workers or community members who were rushing to jump in and save these crack children. We see this movie Losing Isaiah, which when I teach an adoption class, we talk about this film. Halle Berry plays the mother who was high and she leaves her baby in a dumpster. But then when she comes off her high, she regrets it and decides that she wants to parent her child. But by then, the baby has already been rescued by the social worker. And what ensues is a court fight about whether or not Halle Berry's character is allowed to parent her child. Um, we have the story of Michael Orr and the Orr family. Again, he was considered to be rescued by the family because the Tuohys, because his mother was high on crack and he was being neglected, and so they took him in. Of course, the irony is now that we learned that they never actually adopted him, even though that was what they said. She and the family had a career keynoting in spaces talking about the importance of adoption, when in fact we know they never actually formally adopted Michael. Okay, and then here are more examples of the ways we've been socialized to think about adoption. These are some examples that specifically target children. For anybody who is my age or remembers Different Strokes, and there was another show, Webster, these were examples of children. There's another one called Punky Brewster about adoptees and orphans being taken in. It was really common storylines also in other TV shows at the time. We've got the story of Annie, which started out as a comic strip during the 1920s. It's been turned into a long-running Broadway show, and there have been 3 film adaptations. We've got Anne of Green Gables, who it's part of a very popular coming-of-age book series, and about a Canadian girl who's adopted from an orphanage by an elderly brother and sister in Prince Edward Island. That book has also been adapted for theater, films, and television series. Okay, so before I move on, I want to come back to my original prompt. And here's where you can put some of your thoughts in the chat. What are some of the beliefs and narratives about adoption that you see in each of these different examples that I've shown? So we see the white people are the heroes. Yep, white saviorism. They rescued kids. Biological families unfit to parent. Tokenism of children of color. So lucky. Adoptive parents have more money. Yes. Saved from a worse life. Maternal separation is accepted. Yes, thank you all. These are all good examples. Yeah, so some of the things that I had put in my notes in case other people didn't bring it up, but you all have put them in there. Adoption saves children. Assimilation is important and is a good thing. Children's experiences of adoption don't matter. Birth parents can't or are not able to raise their children. Adoptees enjoy a better standard of life via adoption. So the comments about money. Birth parents aren't important. Yeah. All right, exactly. These are some of the things. Well, as we know, there's a lot more to the story. And what we've been finding out over the past many years is that there's a lot of problems in the way we've been practicing adoptions. As I went through, I kind of named some of the things, but here on the slide, you can see a lot more of what we're learning about in terms of some problematic adoption practices and policies. And these outcomes are really tragic for adoptees and their families and the communities of origin. And I think the other thing that maybe people don't think about as often is the degree to which adoptive parents are also harmed through these processes. Okay, so some of the images I have here, very recently, we saw that there was a infant that was found dead inside a safe haven baby box. Um, we've seen, and a lot of this work has been done by journalists, which is really fantastic. American Baby, The Girls Who Went Away, really talk about the experience on US maternity homes, the practice of plenary closed infant adoptions, Finding Fernanda, The Child Catchers. Those are books that really talk about corruption in international adoption. Shattered Bonds, Torn Apart, Dorothy Roberts' seminal pieces talking about the way the child welfare system has been set up to destroy families of color, especially Black families. We have missionaries who are going into other countries and trying to kidnap children to get them out because they think it's going to be a better life for them. We have document of these underground child exchanges, rehoming children, when families take in children, adopt them, and then realize they can't or don't want to care for them anymore, and using these kind of black market ways to get rid of the children. We have Hannah Williams and Devonte Hart, who were murdered by their adoptive parents. More recently, we've got the PBS Frontline documentary about all the problems happening in South Korea. We know that there have been adoptees that have been deported because their adoptive parents didn't get them citizenship. We have just the sheer fact that our birth certificates as an adoptee are false. They're fraudulent identities, really, if you want to think about it at its core, because um, have they don't have our real biogenetic parents listed, and then they're sealed from us, so we don't have the right to our own information in so many different states. So these are all just some aspects of some of the problems inherent in the ways we've been practicing adoption for centuries in the United States. Sorry, I'm going to go back to this. What are some of the counter narratives about these images? What are some of the things that now that you, in contrast to the other images that I showed? And you can put them in the chat. Yep, they show the real story. Any other thoughts? Emphasis on family separation. Unintended consequences. Yeah. People who adopt do not always have children's best interests in mind. Yeah. Thank you. Yep, they go against the positive adoption experiences. Contradicts the cultural fairy tale. Yes, thank you so much. These are really important. So a question we need to ask is, why has the dominant narrative of adoption existed so strongly for such a long time? And what happens when we begin to be aware of these inherent issues? So some things for you to be thinking about. So I mentioned that I draw a lot from critical pedagogy scholars, and Paulo Freire is one that I have been greatly inspired by. Paulo Freire was a Brazilian educator, and he said the oppressor's tranquility rests on how well people fit the world the oppressors have created and how little they question it. So basically, he's really saying those who benefit from the dominant narratives do not want those who are harmed by these practices to question the structures that uphold the oppression. And Freire is really talking about systems. He's a more macro thinker, but the way that he really worked as an activist to help people to dismantle the structures. Because individually, people, again, like we live our world and we don't always know what's happening and how we fit into this larger system. Freir's work was about helping Brazilian um, farmers and those who were not literate to learn how to read and write so that they could better understand the larger systems that were influencing their material lives and their political and social lives. And he really wanted people to understand that it wasn't just that they might be experiencing poverty or they might be experiencing these barriers, but that there was a whole group of people based on certain identities that were experiencing these same uh, had these same experiences. And so he also wanted people to be connected to each other, to be connected to their communities, because it's through community that you can really start to dismantle and deconstruct and then be advocates and activists towards, these different oppressive systems. I, if any of you have seen the Pixar movie, A Bug's Life, there's a scene where the grasshoppers where the lead grasshopper is explaining to some of his army, we have to make sure that the ants never find out that there's more of them than there are of us. And so that active suppression of wanting to keep the power, and part of that is by making sure other people don't have that knowledge and information. So I think about that a lot. In addition to Freire and Henry Giroux, I think about Mexican feminist writer, scholar, activist, Gloria Anzaldúa, and her idea of conocimiento, which is about knowledge or awareness. And she created these 7 stages of conocimiento, meaning how she herself deconstructed this idea of this is who she thought she was, and based on what other people wanted her to be, this idea that she had to be all or nothing. She couldn't be mixed race. She couldn't be both Mexican and American. She couldn't be like she identified as queer, and so the ideas of what her gender was supposed to be. She was trying to deconstruct all of those things, and so she developed these different stages. And in the development of the adoptee consciousness model that my peers and I have put together, we were really influenced by some of the ways that she articulated what it felt like on an individual level to be going through all this process of coming to consciousness about the oppressive messages that you received about who you're supposed to be. We know that Betty Jean Lifton talked about this idea of consciousness raising as awakening from a great sleep, and adoptees talk about it as coming out of the fog. As Ansel Duell would say, once we begin to question the dominant narratives that society has promoted about adoption, it forces us to reinterpret the story that we imagined ourselves living. Um, Coming to consciousness, coming out of the fog, awakening from the great sleep. Uh, as you probably can tell by now, I really like to use film and TV metaphors, but in The Wizard of Oz, when Toto pulls the curtain and you can see that the Wizard of Oz is actually just a regular human being, it's kind of akin to that. It's realizing, yes, okay, it's not what we thought it was. It's uh, in some ways, we think that these messages are so powerful and untouchable, but actually, no, we have the power to dismantle them. Okay, so now I want to kind of talk about these ideas of identity development. So I talked about like the psychosocialization, how we kind of learn these messages, but we all individually kind of go through these different processes of thinking about who we are. So I want to first, Eric Erickson, for some of you who might know about his psychosocial development model, was really one of the first to talk about identity as a prominent aspect of the human lifespan and our human development. And he said that it was in adolescence and young adulthood where we really start to think about our identity. He was the one who kind of termed identity crisis. But really it's about identity exploration. It's kind of like putting on different costumes. I'm going to try out this identity for a while. So this is where we see lots of adolescents go through these different peer groups and think, are they, part of the jocks? Are they a theater nerd? Are they part of band? What sort of peer group do they fit into? Who do they want to be? And they're starting to try on these different identities. Um, and then James Marcia theorized that there's these two different dimensions to how individuals make decisions about their identities. So one dimension is around the degree to which we actively explore aspects of our identity. You can see that's at the top there. And some of us explore a little bit, some explore a lot, some don't explore at all. And then on the other dimension, we have the commitment to an identity. And so some of us commit to an identity and some of us do not commit to an identity. So the way he's thinking about this, for example, is, you could see in examples of when we might engage in an identity, but we don't really commit to it. Or we might commit to an identity without doing much exploration. That's the foreclosure quadrant up there. An example of foreclosure might be, let's say you practice a specific spiritual belief, but it's because you were raised that way. You might have never actively explored why you have these beliefs, or explored or considered any others. Or another example is you could actively explore an identity, but then kind of just become overwhelmed and then actually be like, oh, I don't even want to think about it. I don't want to commit to anything. An example of this might be a person who is multiracial, and maybe they feel like they're being pressured to choose which racial or ethnic group that they identify with. And because they don't want to have to choose, they don't choose. That would be the diffusion example in the quadrant. They might just be like, uh, I'm not any race. I'm a part of the human race. So they'll just not even actively make a decision. That's different than somebody who has explored it and says, I choose to identify as multiracial, because then they've actually made a commitment to something. So that was James Marcia, who kind of was expanding a little bit more on Erik Erikson. Um, Erikson and Marcia don't include adoption as an identity, as an adoptee identity. But there are several research studies that have looked specifically at adoptee identity development. So first, some work that's been led by Hal Grodevant and some of his colleagues. Grodevant was part of one of the largest longitudinal studies. He recently retired, but he did this large study starting in 1986. Um, of birth families, adoptive families, and so adoptive parents and adoptees. And the adoptees were kids at the time. Um, and they've followed these families since 1987, and the study is still active today. So they're continuing to do this work. So they did a specific study about adoptee identity. And you can see 145 adoptees. They were 11 to 20 years at the time that they were interviewed. And similar to Marcia, they came up with these 4 different kind of categories. And they talk about it in terms of identity resolution. So kind of the way they choose to have an identity as an adoptee. So they have the unexamined kind of status, which is that those adoptees said, being adoptee doesn't mean much to me. It's not meaningful. It's not important to my life in any way. There were adoptees who said they had some exploration into their adoptee identity, but overall, it didn't really mean much. So the unexamined group, they didn't want to even do any kind of thinking or exploration around it. It was just they decided it wasn't meaningful or important. Whereas the limited adoptees, they did kind of do a little bit of exploration. But ultimately, like the unexamined, they said it's just not important to who I am. Then there were two different categories of folks who did have some effect. So there was what they called the unsettled adoptees. These were folks who had done a lot of exploring, but as a result of it, they had really strong feelings of rejection, that they felt like being adopted really impacted their identity in very negative ways. Whereas the integrated adoptees, they had done a lot of active exploration and felt that it had helped them develop a coherent, positive view of adoption and what being adopted means in their lives. Now, it's just to be clear, by positive and negative, we're not talking about that they think adoption is a good thing or a bad thing, but that it affected them in kind of negative mental health ways or positive mental health ways. So a person could be critical about adoption, but still find that adoption was important to them and gave them some meaning in their life. So I just want to clarify that. Another study was done by Penny, Borders, and Portnoy, and they explored the ways in which adoptees' level of awareness about adoption impacts their identity. And they have 5 different themes from their interviews that they did. The first theme is about no awareness or denying awareness about the ways adoption impacted their identities. Then there were folks that they said were emerging awareness. These were people who were just starting to understand or think like maybe adoption has affected me in some ways. Then there were those that they called drowning in awareness, and these were folks who were really upset about adoption and that it was really having a strong negative impact in their lives. And they were, as you can see, ill as a hornet, mad as hell. These were quotes from the participants in their study. And then there's the re-emerging from awareness. And these are folks who felt like they were rising from the ashes. So in some ways, it was like they had been drowning in awareness, and then they were kind of like a phoenix coming out saying, okay, I can grow, I can be strong. Um, the challenges of kind of understanding the ways adoption has impacted me has only made me strong and resilient. So they're rising from the ashes. And then there was a group of people that they felt embodied this theme of finding peace, where they were just like, yep, so adoption happened to me, but I'm kind of, it's not negatively impacting me anymore at this point. And then the last one that I want to talk about was a series of 3 studies by Colaner. And she kind of looked at this idea of adoptee identity and created a scale, which she called the Adoptive Identity Work Scale. And this was how adoptees kind of, again, find meaning about their adoptive experience. And she had these different domains she was interested in. So one of them was about exploration. She was curious about, how do adoptees explore adoption? And there's different ways that they do it. She has here, as you can see, there's reflective exploration. This is the way we think about adoption. And then there's behavioral exploration. Behavioral exploration would be more active things that people do. So such as searching for their birth parents. Her scale includes questions about exploration. Here's an example. I have spent a lot of time thinking about my adoption. Another one is, I think a lot about why my birth parents placed me for adoption. These would be reflective exploration questions that she had in her study. And then there's the more reflect or behavioral ones, which would be things around like, I'm actively searching for my birth parents. What she found around this idea of exploration is that those that had higher scores of exploration tended to have higher positive affect or lower negative affect about adoption, meaning it didn't influence them. Like they had, in other words, better mental health, better self-esteem. Um, they didn't maybe ruminate or think a lot about adoption in negative ways internally. And then the second domain was around salience. Salience meaning like the importance, how much does this really matter to a person? Some of the questions on salience include like my adoptive status is an important part of who I am, but is not the most important thing for me. Or I have a clear sense of what my adopted status means for me. And in her study, she found that there really weren't very consistent findings about salience. And then the third domain that kind of emerged after she had done the first study was this idea of preoccupation. Preoccupation means kind of the extent to which people view adoption as their primary identity. And what she found is that people with higher levels of preoccupation were more likely to have low self-esteem, to feel more unsettled about their identity, and to have high levels of frustration. Okay, so these are three kind of important research studies around adoptee identity. So my colleagues and I, um, Susan Bronco, Crippa Cooper-Luter, and Paula O'Laughlin, the four of us met volunteering at Pact Family Camp in 2011. And you know how it is when you find other adoptees and you just click and you're like, yep, those are my people. That's kind of how we felt. And so we've been really tight since then. And over the years, as we have talked a lot about being adoptees, and I should also mention all of us are either um, uh, educators, therapists, counselors, social workers, we've all worked in adoptions in different ways and have done a lot of work with adoptive families. Elizabeth is called PACT, P-A-C-T, and it's based in the Bay Area in California. So one of the things as the four of us have been talking about over all these years is that we think so much about individual identity as adoptees. As you can see from those three different slides I showed around the research, all of those were about individual adoptee identities. And you could also see that many of them looked like they had these kind of linear progressions, like you might start out in one way and end up in another way. And there's kind of a judgment about what's good and what's bad about being in those stages. And the idea is like eventually you're at this stage where you're kind of like wholly actualized. And we wanted to kind of acknowledge that there were strengths and challenges no matter where you might be in your adoptee identity journey. And we also kind of recognize that a lot of the previous research really focused mostly on majority white domestic adoptees. So only Colander had a little bit of a more diverse sample, but there's kind of no intersectional analysis of what it might mean for a person who was an international adoptee from South Korea, like I am, or who was adopted from foster care, but was an African American adoptee, or was a Native American adoptee, indigenous adoptee. So as we were having these conversations, we were thinking about what would adoptee consciousness look like if we thought more about our identity as part of a collective and where we kind of didn't have such a linear progression and we were more intentionally intersectional. There were a couple of adoptee scholars who have been doing research and kind of theorizing around the racial cultural identity aspect for transracial adoptees. So Amanda Baden and her colleagues, I can't remember his name, but Stewart, the two of them have put together this cultural racial identity model. And as you can see, it's like Marcia, it's kind of this quadrant. But what she did was kind of think about, okay, so adoptees are really complicated and transracial adoptees have to navigate multiple cultures. So there's part of us that we are working through in terms of thinking about our own racial and cultural identity. And then there are those of our parents or the way we're socialized. And so she kind of complicated Marcia's identity model a little bit further and applied onto it a racial cultural layer. So adoptees could identify maybe with their adoptive parents' culture, but they may identify with themselves in a very different kind of racial identity. Or they may identify with their parents' racial identity. If their parents are white, even though they may be Latina, for example, they would still maybe want to or have internalized wanting to be white, and so they may identify as white and not as Latina. So it shows that there's many more nuances and complications to the way, especially those of us who are transracial or transcultural, might be thinking about our identities. And then Susan Harris O'Connor developed a racial identity model that I think is really fantastic, um, where she talks about the 5 different types of racial identities that every adoptee of color is going to have. And really also it could apply to white adoptees as well. There is the genetic racial identity, which is what we get from our biological lineage. Okay, so our biogenetic families. Then there's the imposed racial identity, and this is what other people say you are. So we know that those of us walking out in the world, the imposed racial identity for myself, growing up as a Korean adoptee in a white family that didn't discuss race or kind of acknowledge my Korean heritage, the imposed racial identity was as somebody who was white, because what they would actively say, and they said this out of love, I know they said this out of love, but it was still diminishing, was I don't see you as Korean, I see you as my daughter. And that meant that for me to be their daughter, I couldn't be Korean, right? So that was an imposed racial identity that my parents placed on me. There's the cognitive racial identity, which is how I think about my racial identity. So for me, I always felt Korean. I always felt Asian. So for me, there's some cognitive dissonance in the imposed racial identity my parents would place on me versus my own cognitive racial identity. Then there's the visual racial identity, which is what aspects I see when I look at myself in the mirror or see photos of myself. So visually, who do I think I am? What's the racial identity I would ascribe to myself based on just my features? And it's really interesting because as a Korean adoptee, as somebody who's East Asian, I have the folded eyelids, but a lot of Asians, a lot of Koreans do not. And I've had people, including my pediatrician when I was a child, who questioned whether or not I might be half white because I had the folded eyelids. And because in some people's minds, of course, he was white, you know, he's an old school pediatrician. His limited understanding of Asians is that they have the mono eyelid. So there's these ideas about visual racial identity. If you're multiracial, if you're ethnically ambiguous, who do you think you are when you see yourself in the mirror? And then there's that feeling racial identity, which is really at the core in our heart of hearts. Who do we feel that we are? Do I feel Asian? Do I feel Korean? Especially since I was raised outside my culture and without any racial references, how can I feel like I'm actually Korean when I don't know the language, when I don't know any of the customs? So you can see how Baden and Harris O'Connor really helped complicate these other identity models. So kind of thinking about how these might help you in the work that you do with your families or in terms of how you think about yourself, can be really helpful and important kind of aspects of identity for you to be thinking about. Yeah, and so Ruby, thank you. The racial identities can change over time. I didn't know I was white till I searched in my 30s. Absolutely. And this is exactly what I'm getting to when I say that you know, my colleagues and I really wanted to complicate this idea of these linear progressions, or that you start in one way and you end in another way and that's where you stay. There's kind of this idea of stasis in terms of racial identity. That's a little bit more an older way of thinking, and thankfully these newer ways over the past 20 years have been helpful in all of us kind of thinking about our identities and how they change over time. And so I'm going to talk about that through this adoptee consciousness model. So I mentioned my colleagues, Paula, Kripa, and Susan, and we reached out to Grace Newton, who's a Chinese adoptee, because she had written this really amazing autoethnography about her experience being in college, attending a class about adoption taught by a Korean adoptee that was critical, and the kind of mind-blowing revelations she was having, learning, like that one slide I showed you about all the kind of problems when you're raised to have these other views about adoption, um, and then it all gets upended. And how hard emotionally that was and cognitively. And she had written this really beautiful article, and we were developing our model at the time, and we reached out to ask her if she wanted to help be part of that with us. So we have conceptualized adoptee consciousness as um, a spiral. And we have these different kind of touchstones around the spiral: status quo, rupture, dissonance, expansiveness, and forgiveness and activism. And we think of them as these touchstones, we think of them as what we're experiencing at any given time in our adoptee journey. We see adoptees as being able to be in multiple touchstones at the same time because our identities are so multi-layered that we can really be in different aspects simultaneously. So in one aspect about thinking about adoption, we might be kind of experiencing status quo, but we might totally be in dissonance or activism or expansiveness around another dimension of our adoptee identity. Gloria Anzaldúa says that all aspects of consciousness or knowing are present within every stage. She's talking about her process of conocimiento. They occur concurrently and chronologically or not, which we love. So as a personal example, when I started to come into critical consciousness about race, that happened much earlier for me than other aspects around adoption practices. For example, I didn't question that my adoption might have been unethical or illegal. And the whole idea about I didn't question that I had a fake birth certificate that said my adoptive parents gave birth to me in Seoul. Those things didn't happen until later. But I was very conscious around race because, as I mentioned, I, from a very early age, always thought of myself as Korean, knew I was Korean, saw myself as Asian. I just didn't really understand how that related to the other adoption part. That makes sense. And that could be the opposite for somebody else. For somebody else, they may have been starting to have questions around adoption, but not thinking about race at all, or their gender and the way that gender plays such a huge role for many of us in terms of adoption, because so many of us have adopted parents who wanted to adopt a child of a certain gender. And so then what does that do to us and our identity when we realize, oh, my parents wanted a girl or my parents wanted a boy, and so I was adopted because of that. Right? Those are all very complicated. Or for trans adoptees, for example, who are a different gender than what they were assigned. And so then their adoptive parents wanted a girl, but they ended up with a son, right? How does that affect us? And so for those of you professionals, you're going to see these all the time when you're working with the adoptee population. You might be working with parents who are really struggling to understand why their adopted child is experiencing, a child or adult now, is exhibiting all these different behaviors or saying things to them, and they're not going to necessarily understand. Yes, late discovery transracial adoptee. We're going to talk about that too. So when I was really thinking about how to visualize how it felt for me to move through the adoptee consciousness model and kind of the stability of my identity when I was younger, I started thinking about it like a Jenga game. So we're going to use the Jenga game as a visual to talk about coming to consciousness and how that might affect the way we have to reinterpret our adoption stories. Starting with status quo, I start with this mostly because so many of us can relate to being in this touchstone, and it's where many of us start. Um, Adoptees experiencing status quo often accept the dominant narrative about adoption. They don't want to question individual or structural factors that might lead to adoption. Oftentimes, we prefer the more simplistic reasons. And because of this, we might reject any nuances in adoption, what I call the both ands in adoption, such as I can love my adoptive parents and wish that I hadn't been adopted. And so adoptees experiencing status quo might have a sense that all is not what it appears, but that maybe they don't want to rock the boat, or they might accept the adoption gaslighting and race lighting they get from other people in their lives. As Andy Costin said on an episode of the fantastic podcast Adoptees On, supporting the dominant narrative can be a coping skill. A lot of adoptees cannot acknowledge that adoption is anything other than love because then they would have to feel those feelings that they've been hiding and ignoring. So it's a coping skill. Some adoptees don't just accept the dominant narrative, they might promote it, even to the point of getting antagonistic with other adoptees who have different viewpoints. You know, the person who's spearheading all of the safe haven baby box legislation around the country is an adoptee. Adoptees experiencing status quo might be supporting adopted because it feels unsafe to do otherwise. You know, Korean adoptee Jenna, Mayor Jenna, she goes by on social media, wrote this post as an adoptee. It felt unsafe to challenge my worldview because then it would call into question every assumption and reality of my identity. Very similar to what Andy Cussin said in hers as well. So this is really important for us to remember. Um, Being in status quo protects us from potential abandonment from family, friends, peers, and society. If we say we have critical questions about adoption, then we might get the gaslighting or the anger from other people who might benefit from adoption, such as adoptive parents and adoption professionals. So being in status quo can be a strength because it can be something that protects us, right? So one of the things that we want to make sure that we're really emphasizing as we talk about the adoptee consciousness model is that we really want people to understand just how complicated it is to be in all of these different areas because we want people to have compassion and empathy and understanding because, you know, when we talk about like mass movements, social protest movements, one of the problems that we have is we often have these kind of checklists of like, you have to believe all these things for you to be included in this movement. And um, some of the, I think the most profound things I've heard from leaders of these movements is that we need to provide on-ramps for people to join the movement. We can't put up barriers that are just as large and challenging to overcome as what the other side wants for us. So as we're going through these, think about ways that as you're encountering adoptees who might be experiencing these different touchstones, how we can be compassionate, how we can help them as they're starting to question and understanding why they might be thinking and in that touchstone. Okay, another touchstone that we identify adoptees as experiencing is rupture. I've talked about a couple of examples for me. One of the things is when I went to South Korea for the first time and did a birth family search, first of all, I went to get my papers, my adoption records. I wanted to look at them. I learned that I wasn't born in Seoul. I learned that I was actually born in a totally different part of the country. And so as you start to kind of look at all these things, there are some dates of where I supposedly were in different orphanages that didn't line up, like they overlapped. And so it definitely there's something happening there. And so I think for a lot of us, once we start to realize these inconsistencies or things aren't the way that it seemed, Then we are forced, those are rupture moments. Gloria Anzaldúa would call them earthquakes, and they can be big earthquakes or they can be tiny earthquakes, but they shatter what we thought we knew. So rupture refers to any time when an adoptee encounters information or has an experience that disrupts their sense of status quo. They might learn their adoption information is inaccurate, false, unethical, or illegal. When we see the recent Frontline documentary about Korean adoptions, for example, we might find out that our birth parents were lied to or coerced, or that there was money exchanged for us, that our birth families might have tried to get us back. For some adoptees, and we've already seen this in the comments, they may not have ever realized that they were adopted. And so we call it late discovery adoptee. They find out later. Oftentimes it's because they pass in their adoptive families in terms of racial or ethnic um, I, uh, identity. And the real kind of traumatizing aspect of it is that um, oftentimes everybody else knew except for the adoptee that they were adopted. We use, for those of us who developed this model, we like to use the example of the scene from This Is Us. In this scene, Randall is confronting his adoptive mom because he finds out that she's always known his birth father. She's known who he was and had been in contact with them, and yet had never disclosed it to Randall and lied about it when he would ask questions about his birth parents. So, if there, you can find this scene online if you haven't seen the show. But it's really sums up, I think, the way a lot of us feel when we have these rupture moments. For transracial adoptees, um, the rupture might be when you realize that other people see you as a person of color because you were raised to be white and you have maybe this internal identification as white. And so now when other people are starting to refer to you as a person of color, you know, um, that can be really rupturing. When I think about the beliefs that I had based on the internalization of these messages, it feels like my Jenga block is starting to fall apart because I'm pulling each of those different things. Rupture prompts us to critique our own perspectives and assumptions. It makes us have to start to reinterpret the story we imagined ourselves living. So these stories that we're told that I was abandoned, that was chosen, that I was better off, that adoption's a gift. As you can see, like when you start to pull those out, it creates a very fragile identity that feels like it could topple at any moment. Ruptures, as Gloria Anzaldúa would say, are both an ending and a beginning. Sometimes after a rupture, an adoptee might go back to the comfort of status quo. Maybe they're just not feeling ready to address these rupturing information that they've received. They could double down. They could seek confirmation that the status quo is where they want to be. Some adoptees experience a dissonance touchstone after a rupture. So dissonance is when your whole identity feels like it's been shaken and destroyed. Adoptees experiencing dissonance might feel torn between different identities and realities. I've known adoptees who ended relationships with people in their lives, partners, spouses, parents, friends, while they're experiencing dissonance because it can be such a tough time to be um, figuring out who you are. Adoptees will oftentimes seek validation from other adoptees at this time, but they're still often trying to figure out what they believe. So they might want to be part of an adoptee community. Maybe they find an online Facebook group, but then they get really upset when other people critique adoption, or they might also be upset when other people support adoption in those groups. So it can be a time where you just really are still trying to figure out what you actually believe. Some adoptees might choose to embrace the status quo again to because dissonance is so challenging. So they might go back and say, you know, status quo feels good for me. Some adoptees might experience dissonance as their primary touchstone. So for anyone who's experienced a rupture, I'm not sure that we actually really ever leave dissonance. We may feel like we've resolved certain feelings of conflict or tension, but then something can happen and can propel us right back into dissonance again. So for example, when I watched the AP Frontline documentary, and like I've known that there's been corruption happening in the in South Korean adoptions since 2000 because I met other adoptees and I learned about adoptees who had found their birth families and found out that their families had been lied to, or, you know, that they had been placed for adoption as a substitute for another child who was supposed to have gone, and nobody told anybody. Deanne Bourget-Lim's film, First Person Plural, for example, her adoptive parents had been told they were getting another child, and she was sent in their place and was told, don't tell them who you really are. So when we start to confront these things, like it can propel us back to feelings we might have had of dissonance earlier in our identity journeys. Okay, so another touchstone that we have identified is called expansiveness. And for expansiveness, we see this as a time when adoptees really begin to lean into exploring and reinterpreting their story. In our focus groups that we did around this model, adoptees often use the term reinvention, reincorporating, or reckoning. Uh, we see this as a time when adoptees are really generative. They're doing birth family searches, they're traveling to their birth countries or to the states where they were born. They're researching, maybe they're immersing themselves in their birth cultures, taking language lessons, and looking for community. Adoptees in expansiveness touchstones are desiring a more complex understanding of adoption. Like they're actively no longer struggling necessarily with the both and they're seeking the both and. They're really trying to find out more information and trying to find things that will help support them. In this social media post here by transracial adoptee therapist Marcelo Maslow, she writes that coming into consciousness when it comes to adoption is an ongoing process of learning, unlearning, and learning again. And I just think that sums it up so nicely. Adoptees will often engage in adoptee-centric projects such as art, poetry, activism. They'll create groups, support groups, things to help other adoptees. And interesting, at this point, other people in an adoptee's life might be accusing them of going overboard or becoming too immersive. We see this happen a lot, criticisms by family members who don't understand. They might say you're becoming obsessed, that you can't see anything else, but it's really just a time when adoptees are trying to explore and be expansive and grow and learn. And there's so many different ways of doing that. Okay, so our last touchstone, we called forgiveness and activism. I put in here, or is it activism and forgiveness? Uh, I will say this is the most controversial touchstone that we've conceptualized. And a lot of it is around this pushback about forgiveness and what do we mean by forgiveness? So we want to be clear that forgiveness doesn't mean we don't hold people or systems accountable for the harms that they've done. But what we're seeing is that adoptees shift away from just seeing the personal impact of adoption and starting to see that there's maybe a sense of responsibility to the larger community of adoptees. And for some, it may include also, when we're thinking adoption community, it might be a sense of responsibility to also adoptive parents, to first families, to the adoption professionals, whatever spaces that they're in. An adoptee may focus on challenging systemic oppression and adoption practices in society. Um, they might focus on the process of forgiveness for what they did not know, what they did not get from others, because the system was set up to conceal the truth from them. Adoptees might focus on challenging dominant narratives, and they may commit to advocacy or activism for adoptees, first families, and other populations harmed by adoption. I think it's really important for us to also remember that adoptees are also adoptive parents. They're also first families. They're also adoption professionals. So just in the same way that a lot of adoptee identity models think of us as just forever children, we become adults and we have these very nuanced lives, and intersectional lives. And so we have to remember that when we're just saying something from just one perspective, that that person might be holding multiple statuses. So I think that that's really important. Um, Indigenous transracial adoptee Raven Sinclair, she's in Canada, talks about the difference between toxic anger and righteous rage, and that one can harm us and one can motive us to address injustices. So I also want to say that just as there are nuances in all these other different aspects of these touchstones, that in the forgiveness and activism space, we can see ways that our activism can be harmful too. So we have to make sure that when we're doing activism, that we are not subscribing to this either or, that you have to be a certain way or believe in a certain thing in order to be an activist. Activism looks many different ways. I've seen lateral harm happen in our communities because some of us might be operating still from a dissonance framework, even though we're also doing activism. Because remember, as I said, we can be doing multiple things at the same time. Our activism might be based on our own individual sense of wanting personal justice rather than a community perspective. Um, So these are just a few examples of adoptee activists and things that are happening in these spaces, podcasts, legal help, advocating for adoptee citizenship, creating our own organizations and providing spaces for adoptees. I want to come back a little bit just to this idea of forgiveness again, because forgiveness is really about helping us understand the broader systems of oppression that led to our adoption that are out of our control. And having compassion for our past beliefs and opinions recognizes that we were intentionally, kept from knowing our truth. Forgiveness can be forgiving ourselves for not exploring or questioning sooner. We might choose to forgive people when it feels right, but again, it doesn't mean that we don't hold people accountable. Um, for example, some adoptees might forgive their adoptive parents for not knowing better, for understanding that they adopted at a time when they had received these different messages about adoption, and they didn't question. I've had conversations, some hard conversations with my adoptive parents. Um, for example, when I was young, they took me to our adoption agency that had a picnic for families that had adopted Korean children, and I did not enjoy it. They said that I cried the whole time, that there was a Korean social worker on staff who came up and talked to me in Korean, and that it just, I lost it. They didn't understand because nobody was supporting them and helping them understand why I might be reacting the way I was reacting. Was I afraid this Korean social worker was going to take me back to Korea? Did she scold me and tell me you better be a good child? Like nobody knows what happened. My parents say, we're sorry that we didn't try again. We're sorry that we didn't come back and realize, that maybe that was just one experience, and we should have tried other things that you might have liked better. Right. So I can go back, I can forgive them for not knowing that because they did what they were told. They did according to what their social workers, how they had been supported and taught. So they didn't know. We are now having these hard conversations because, you know, they didn't get the support that they needed back in the day. I just want to acknowledge all the really amazing comments that I'm seeing in the chat. Thank you so much for everybody who's sharing so vulnerably. Mike Hoyt, who is also on Adoptees On and is a friend of mine actually from Minnesota, where I used to live before I moved out to Washington. It said, I've come to forgive my younger self for not being as vocal or powerful as I could have been, but also now I'm challenging myself to turn up the volume now. As Maya Angelou would say, when we know better, we do better. Okay, so kind of thinking back to some of the powerful things that Gloria Anzaldúa has said. When we're thinking about activism, when we're thinking about where we are, whether it's we're experiencing a rupture or dissonance or status quo, wherever we are in our identity journeys, she says, it's not enough to stand on the opposite riverbank shouting questions, challenging patriarchy, white conventions. At some point on our way to a new consciousness, we'll have to leave the opposite bank, that split between two mortal combats, somehow healed so that we are on both shores at once. To me, this really speaks to dissonance. But then she says, or perhaps we'll decide to disengage from the dominant culture, write it off altogether as a lost cause, and cross the border into a wholly new and separate territory. Or we might go another route. The possibilities are numerous once we decide to act and not react. And so I think there's a big part of this idea of like reacting and not reacting. Hopefully, as we are making our way, thinking about our identities, this active exploration, I'm just encouraging everybody to really just stick with it, with the active exploration, and find support wherever you are in the process. One of the things that our focus groups that we conducted around the adoptee consciousness model really struck was that at every single touchstone, adoptees were talking about how important community was for them. Adoptee community was critically important to them. So that is something that, again, I feel like I'm hoping our model really emphasizes that this is a personal journey, but it's also a community journey. So as we think about critical consciousness, there is some research on critical consciousness, and Diemer and colleagues kind of talk about some of the important aspects of critical consciousness. There's two components, and you kind of saw some of this in some of the other models where we talk about the difference between reflection and action. So critical reflection and critical action are both important. And Diemer in his studies ended up theorizing that high levels of critical reflection might be more important in the development of engagement and motivation to be part of these activist spaces by providing individuals with the capacity and the agency to navigate all the different structural barriers that kind of get in the way. And but that it might be high levels of critical action, which is participation in social and political action, that facilitates the movement that we need to really help people feel similarly called to act in other ways of life. Um, and in this way, Diemer and his colleagues were talking about students and their critical consciousness and critical action, but I think it applies to all individuals and communities. And so one of the things I think is interesting is that your critical action in one kind of identity of your life. Remember that slide that had all those different parts about race and gender and family and status and mental health and class. Lots of us, I think, when we start to get active in movements to dismantle oppression in one area of our life, it kind of can bleed over into others. And again, we're really complicated people, many of us. So our focus group participants, many of them were talking about, I'm really involved in LGBTQIA spaces and activism, but I've never thought about talking about my adoptee identity in those spaces. Or I'm very active in adoptee spaces, but I don't talk much about my LGBTQIA status in those adoptee spaces. And thinking about ways that we can find these affinity groups and bring that conversation into all the different domains and spheres of our life. And so I see a lot of adoptees as they start to explore the adoption part of it, they're also necessarily having to think about what that looks like in other aspects of their lives. George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, COVID and the rising anti-Asian hatred, those things were really influential for a lot of the adoptees of color in our focus groups because it was like the first time that they really thought, oh, my identity as a person of color, my identity as a person who's queer really is bleeding over into my adoptee identities in ways that I hadn't really thought of before. So over the past 20 years, I've worked in child welfare and in adoption, post-adoptions, and more importantly, I've been part of the adoptee community even longer than that. And so for the adoption professionals and agencies who are attending this presentation today, thank you so much. Based on my experience as a former professional and in the community with adoptees, I now believe that adoptees cannot expect the systems that harm us to be the systems that heal us. So this is my call to action for all of you. If you are not an adoptee and you want to support us, now is the time for you to support adoptees who are doing this work. So instead of starting your own programs, contract with adoptees who are already supporting other adoptees. One of the biggest challenges adoptees have is being undermined or discounted by adoption organizations and agencies. But you can help fund us. You can help us get money. You can help refer clients to us. You can help with access. You can use your power and your privilege and access that you have to elevate adoptee organizations and leaders. And for adoptees, there are many of us out here doing great work and supporting adoptees. It might take a while, but I really encourage you to take as much time as you need. Look for those spaces that will help you as you begin the work of reinterpreting your story. Okay, so thank you all. Here are some of the ways that you can learn more about me and my work. Harlow's Monkey, that second link there is the website that I started in 2006. The Adoptee Consciousness Model has its own website. If you want to learn more, you can follow me on Instagram, LinkedIn. I have Facebook pages too. I did add a couple of slides to this. I had given another copy to AKA before, and so I will make sure they get this one so that you have all the updated slides. Here are my references as well. But I'll go back here, and if I think we have now like about 15 minutes for questions.